Good evening. My name is John Shelton, and I serve on the Grand Lodge of Virginia Committee of Masonic Education as the Assistant Dean of the Virginia Masonic University. I'm pleased to come to you tonight so we can resume our study of Masonry as part of the VMU system. Tonight we're going to cover the Fellowcraft degree. So let's get started by talking about the Fellowcraft degree and the philosophy of it. As we learned before in the Entered Apprentice degree, the three-degree system of Blue Lodge Masonry represents a progressive system. The first degree focuses on governing the passions. The second degree, which we'll cover tonight, has more to do with the intellect, cultivating the mind, learning new things. With the Fellowcraft degree, we're entering the world of the intellect. And what we want to do is turn our focus towards instilling the proper attitude towards learning and pursuing intellectual virtue. Each of us has to be a lifelong learner in many things, the same as with Masonry. In the Fellowcraft stage, his task is to acquire knowledge and apply it to the building of his character and improving the society in which he lives. This is part of the self-improvement plan of Masonry, which seeks to provide a well-rounded man, sort of like a Renaissance man, something like that. We find many venues where self-improvement and continuous education are important, especially in college, but also in vocational studies as well. Now, as we have discussed in the first module, Entered Apprentice, Masonry is moral philosophy, also known as ethics. We base our ethical system in the West on the classical Greek tradition. This is where we have the definition of virtue. Virtue for a man consisted of using his reason to attain happiness. Now, to that world, in history, the Christian world has added the three theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity. Taken all together, these comprise the 7 virtues. The Church teaches that the cardinal virtues are perfectible by man on his own effort, while the theological virtues are thought to be given by the grace of God alone. Now, I'm taking a minute to cover this because it's important for the Mason to understand the basic classical and Judeo-Christian ethical systems to understand what's in Masonry. I'll give you an example of that. I was once in a lodge, and the speaker for that evening was a very interesting man that spoke on Neoplatonism. It was very detailed. Neoplatonism is a fascinating ethical time period, but without understanding what Platonism is, it's very difficult to say what Neoplatonism is. So you do have to take some time to unfold and get a good basis in some of these things before moving on to more advanced topics. We hope to provide you with some of that by looking at some of these things in the VMU materials. Therefore, one of the things I'd like to encourage you to study is the Bible. Much of our prayers and ritual are based in biblical settings, and we can, for instance, find a full description of Solomon's temple in the first book of Kings, chapter 5 to 8. This is important to understand the basis of motifs and ritual that we use in Masonry. In fact, we'll take just a minute and talk about Solomon's temple. Solomon's temple was much more than a place of worship, a place to gather, which is what we usually think of a church today. It was meant to be the dwelling place of God on earth. Its construction was a very serious endeavor. And taking that basic metaphor of constructing Solomon's temple and relating it to building character shows what a serious endeavor we are on. You can learn a lot about Solomon's temple, of course, in the Bible, but there are many educational resources that you should look to include National Geographic and other programs and books, things like that. But I encourage you to take a look at it. During the second degree, we are urged to pursue a liberal education based on the 7 liberal arts and sciences. The 7 liberal arts and sciences were considered the standard curriculum for a free educated man in the Middle Ages. The intent here is to prepare the mind for the spiritual truths which we're going to find later on in the Master Mason's degree. So this gives us a basic understanding of what we're trying to do with the Fellowcraft's degree. And I'd like to take a moment now to let you talk with your facilitator and ask some questions on the material that we have, and I'll join you in just a moment. Welcome back, brethren. We pick up with the symbolism of the Fellowcraft degree. Now, the symbolism of the EA degree emphasizes beginnings, spiritual birth, first steps, youth, orientation to the light, and so forth. The symbolism of the Fellowcraft's degree emphasizes the methods of developing and progressing in the craft, which is symbolic of the emergence into philosophical and spiritual manhood. We've taken what we learned in the Entered Apprentice degree and elevated it up to a new level. You can even see this in the working tools associated with the degrees. The working tools now are testing instruments. We use them to try, square, and prove. With them, we learn to develop the faculty of judgment. What is valuable? What is true? What is real? Now, the central motif of this Fellowcraft degree is the symbol of the winding staircase, consisting of a number of steps leading to the middle chamber of the temple. Staircases, ladders, extended vertical ropes, and mountains are all symbols of ascending to new heights and seeking wisdom. Gaining entrance to this new place symbolizes a distinct advancement in our work as Freemason. Now, these benefits that we receive are symbolized by corn, wine, and oil. And they show the sort of things that you can attain in life if you put your mind to it, and the benefits you can expect to obtain living the right kind of life. We'll move on now to number, order, symmetry, and proportion. The great teachings of this degree are all around the importance of the Masonic study of number, order, symmetry, and proportion. Geometry takes a central place. The importance and greatness of geometry was stressed by Pythagoras, Euclid, Archimedes, Plato. Geometry, with its axioms and proofs, was so useful in measuring nature and explaining its relationships that it was thought to have an almost godlike quality in helping us understand how the universe was built. Many philosophies in the Renaissance and the Enlightenment pointed to geometry as a critical sphere of understanding. Spinoza, for instance, is a well-known philosopher. He actually used geometry and its axioms and proofs to set up an ethical system, and he reasoned through step by step in an ethical sense using the logic of geometry. I'd like to pick up there and talk a little bit about natural philosophy. This is the forerunner of modern science, and it emerged during the late Renaissance and Enlightenment. Through natural philosophy, these early scientists were able to explore the heavens using tools like the telescope and could obtain a great understanding of God's creation and perhaps some insight into God's plan and how He created this wonderful universe around us. Let's leave off there and we'll come back and talk about history behind the Fellowcraft degree. Thank you. Welcome back. We're going to talk a little bit about the historical time period that preceded up to the formation of Masonry. Let's talk about it broadly to start with. We can basically divide history into three time periods leading up to Masonry, which are Classical, Middle Ages, and the Modern period. The Classical period encompasses the ancient Greek and Roman worlds up to the fall of Rome in 476. The Middle Ages, also known as the Dark Ages, cover the period from the fall of Rome all the way up to the fall of Constantinople in 1453. This period saw the spread and domination of Christianity in Europe. The Modern period begins with the Renaissance in the 1300s. We'll take a look at the time period, especially from the Renaissance leading into the Enlightenment, as it was critical for Masonry. The Renaissance starts in the 1300s and continues on into the 1600s. As a cultural movement, it was a revival of all things classical, to include literature, architecture, all sorts of pursuits. During the Renaissance, we find the rebirth of rationality, reason, and humanism that had been so fundamental to Greek civilization. After the fall of Constantinople in 1453, there was a mass exodus of scholars and texts from the east to the west. Western scholars started to collect and analyze some of those ancient texts of the philosophers: Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, Euclid. This fascination with man is evident in the brilliance of Renaissance art. For example, the beautiful statue of David by Michelangelo. This spirit of learning and rationality, coupled with exceptional inventions like the printing press from Gutenberg, greatly enhanced the availability of books and documents for the common people. And this helped fuel the freedom of thought emerging all over Europe. We see the beginnings of modern science in particular, where we see Copernicus developing the theory of heliocentrism, the idea that the earth actually revolved around the sun. Galileo also defended this concept, which was of course perceived as a challenge to the church's authority. He was arrested for that belief and later forced to recant. Also during this period, Sir Francis Bacon developed the earliest version of the scientific method, performing experiments and capturing data to support his hypotheses. Towards the end of the 1600s, the Renaissance gave way to the Age of Enlightenment. This philosophic movement advocated reason as a primary basis of authority, and reason assumed an even greater influence, especially in the fields of politics and religion. The Enlightenment was marked by a decline in influence of the Catholic Church and the concept of monarchy, that is, the divine right of kings to rule. Men began to question the dogmas associated with each that had been in place for so long. Freedom of thought was really emerging in this time period. We know in history that the ideals of the Enlightenment contributed greatly, for instance, to the American and French revolutions. In fact, some would say the American Revolution is the best realization of Enlightenment ideals, to include the balance of liberty, freedom of religion, speech, republicanism, limited government. In many ways, the American Revolution is a continuation and perfection of the ideals built during the British Enlightenment, borrowing from many of its leaders, such as John Locke. The French Revolution began with high ideals of liberty, fraternity, and equality. However, these concepts were taken to the extreme by demagogues such as Robespierre. This led the movement to implode ultimately, culminating in the terror of the guillotine. And it demonstrates that even the best principles and highest aspirations, when not properly balanced, can lead to ruin. So we'll take a moment to pause, and I'd like you to reflect on the American and French revolutions and the Renaissance leading to the Enlightenment, and we'll come back to Masonry as it emerged in England. Welcome back. We're going to talk a little bit now about Freemasonry in England. Now, Freemasonry was born in England, as we learned in the last course, in 1717 with the formation of the Grand Lodge. England was a much friendlier environment for Masonry to be flourishing and expanding. The modern system of speculative Masonry, which we're so familiar with today, was really constructed in the 1720s and 30s. And from there, of course, we know it spread around the world. In England, as in America, it has been generally identified with the establishment. And in England, in fact, it has been long patronized by the royal family, the Church of England, and many leaders in British society, which gives it overall a more conservative flavor. There are several historical reasons for this. First, in the area of religion, Henry VIII by 1536 had broken all ties with the Roman Catholic Church. This removed the Catholic Church from its position of influence in English politics. And it also put England on the road to learning how to balance Catholic, Anglican, and Puritan sects and interests, long before the rest of Europe came to grips with this. We see this type of toleration culminating later on in 1688 with the Toleration Act. In the political sphere, you have to consider the English Civil War, which went on from about 1642 to 1659 with Oliver Cromwell. During this period, Parliament engaged in a struggle against King Charles I, culminating in his trial and death in 1649. Parliament sought to establish that the king could not simply dissolve the institution and direct it to do his bidding. This was at odds with the traditional concept of the divine rights of kings. Eventually, Cromwell and the parliamentarians defeated Charles and set the country on a road to a constitutional monarchy, which was finally realized in the Glorious Revolution of 1688. These historical factors in England created an ideal environment for Masonry to be born and to flourish. On the continent, however, the struggles against the church and monarchy were still in full sway. Therefore, as the church in Europe saw Masonry arriving to Europe in the 1730s, they could see a more revolutionary flavor that would challenge their authority in Europe. And you can see this even today with the lodges on the continent, where they reflect a somewhat greater emphasis on social progress and political activism. One of the great Masonic heroes, I would say, in Europe was actually in Italy, named Garibaldi. He helped establish the Italian Republic. Now, it's important to understand the environment in England in the early 1720s to appreciate the nature of Freemasonry. And we also have to take a look at some of the early founders, such as Dr. John Desaguliers, Martin Folkes, and George Payne. The key term we will examine is the British Enlightenment and what that meant to Masonry at that critical time in the 1720s when modern speculative Masonry was built. We'll begin with the British Enlightenment with the Glorious Revolution of 1688. This was a seminal event and traditionally marks the beginning of the British Enlightenment. This ended the reign of James II, whereby Parliament invited William and Mary to come from the Netherlands and rule England. It was soon followed by a number of very important acts that were passed that cemented the new political spirit and the new political reality in England. One was the Toleration Act of 1688, which gave dissenters from the Church of England some ability to practice their religion. Another was the Bill of Rights of 1689. Now, in this time period, 1688, we mark the entrance of one of the greatest physicists and scientists of all time, Sir Isaac Newton. This man's influence on science was beyond description, which is demonstrated by his masterpiece, the Principia of 1687. Here he laid down the theory of gravity and the mechanical system which governs the universe, the law of attraction, and so forth. This led up to a time period in England in the late 1600s, early 1700s, where we see many scientific demonstrations across the country. Men like Desaguliers, which I mentioned earlier, were providing all kinds of demonstrations of modern science, much of which based on the Newtonian approach to science. In fact, the Reverend John Desaguliers was one of Sir Isaac Newton's greatest disciples. He was also a Freemason, an early Grand Master, an engineer, and a scientific demonstrator for the Royal Society. The Royal Society was founded in 1660 as the first formal organization of scientists in the world. Desaguliers was a prominent member. In fact, many of the most influential founders of Masonry in the 1720s and 30s were also fellows of the Royal Society. Sir Robert Moray was an even earlier example. His initiation into speculative Masonry is one of the earliest on record, being in 1646. Another founding member of the Royal Society is Sir Christopher Wren. He was both an operative and speculative Mason. Perhaps the greatest architect in English history, he was instrumental in the rebuilding of London after the fire of 1666. His crowning achievement was the completion of St. Paul's Cathedral in 1708. Now, considering the quality of men that we find as the early founders of Freemasonry, and as also members of the Royal Society, the importance of that scientific society, Masonry clearly was an important organization to join. Indeed, our own Benjamin Franklin was awarded the prestigious Copley Medal by the Royal Society in 1753 and elected to membership into 1756. Let's take a moment then to reflect on the environment of Newtonianism and scientific endeavors, and we will return in just a moment. Welcome back. We left off talking about the Royal Society and many of its influential members who are also founding fathers of Freemasonry in England. I want to call your attention also to some currents of esoteric thought and mysticism during the Renaissance and Enlightenment that contributed to the development of Freemasonry. The late Renaissance saw a lot of mystical types of thought coming to the fore, and we know that this sort of mixed in with the beginning of the Enlightenment and the beginning of science. For example, Sir Isaac Newton is well known for his contributions to physics and optics, but it's less well known that he was fascinated with the Temple of Jerusalem and its sacred measurements and proportions. He believed they held clues to hidden knowledge in the Bible. He was also obsessed with alchemy, devoting much time to its study. This fascination with the Temple of Solomon, alchemy, Hermeticism, and other esoteric pursuits was widespread in England at that time, and certainly helped influence the early development of Masonic ritual by Desaguliers and his group. But to conclude, speculative Freemasonry was born truly at the early stage of the British Enlightenment, shortly after the formation of the Grand Lodge in 1717. Although based on the earlier operative model, the new model created by Desaguliers and his comrades reflected their priorities. This generally included membership in the Royal Society, a Newtonian scientific outlook, a pro-Hanoverian political stance, and being supportive of the Whig Party. Not always, but in general this was true. They also leveraged the nobility in England for Grand Lodge leadership in order to provide legitimacy and a greater attraction for men to join. In summary, Masonry reflects free thinking, the emergence of modern science, natural philosophy, a modern political posture based on a constitutional monarchy, and religious toleration. The British Enlightenment represents the creation of the modern world, and Freemasonry can rightly be seen as reflecting and preserving that tradition. There are numerous books that you may look at that are listed in your reading materials. The Foundations of Modern Freemasonry by Rick Berman, The Creation of the Modern World by Roy Porter, and other books, and I encourage you to take a look at them. Again, I'd like to stress that it's important to understand what was going on in England in the 1720s and 30s to get a true feeling for the underlying currents of the ritual in Freemasonry. Thank you, and we'll start again on the knowledge of the Fellowcraft degree in just a moment. Brethren, welcome back. We're going to talk a little bit now about the Fellowcraft degree itself and interpret a little bit of the ritual. The first thing I'd like to talk about is allegory. What is allegory? Well, it's a story with both a literal and a symbolic meaning. The main purpose of an allegory is to stimulate the imagination and allow the reader to explore multiple symbolic meanings without saying what the ultimate meaning must be. A very good example of allegory is The Wizard of Oz. Many people have seen The Wizard of Oz, and I think to myself, having seen it, when I first saw it as a boy, I only had a childish interpretation of what I was seeing. When I saw it as a teenager, it started to dawn on me the symbolism of some of the characters and the meanings of what Dorothy was seeking. But by the time you see it as an adult, you can see a lot of deep symbolic meaning in such a story. This is the beauty of allegory, as it stimulates your thought. We have a wonderful allegory in Masonry that is centered around the building of King Solomon's temple. All of the tools and the symbols that we use in Masonry, and talking about the way that temple is built and fits together, relating that to the way we build character and virtue on the inside, this is a fascinating allegory, and the metaphors are many. This stimulates much thought about what virtue and character really are, what it means to be a good man, and how we can get along better. So why do we use allegory, symbols, and secrecy? Again, it provides an interesting story that entices a man to think through the lessons and to gain truth for himself. It captures your imagination, encourages you to ponder the moral lessons being presented. If we simply presented these mysteries in a bland black and white format, they could go in one ear and out the other easily. But by using the allegory and the symbolism and so forth, we're capturing the imagination and causing men to think for themselves. Now, the degrees represent the journey towards a better life. We've already talked about the Entered Apprentice module, which is about governing the passions, the Fellowcraft, which is about adorning the mind, and the Master Mason still to come, which is to have faith in the Spirit. We are inspired by the analogy of the sun, which rises in the east, reaches its zenith at midday by way of the south, and sets in the west. All of this can represent the experience of human life, moving from youth to manhood to old age. The enthusiastic visions, for instance, of youth, the man shouldering the burden in the middle of the day, and the old man reflecting on his life in old age. All of these models stimulate our imagination and cause us to ponder what's important in life. Now, the scriptural lesson in the Fellowcraft's degree takes a passage from Amos, who was one of the lesser prophets of the Old Testament. He was a herdsman and tender of fig trees. He foretold many judgments of God that were to fall on the Syrians, Philistines, Edomites, and so forth. He describes a vision shown to him by God. In this vision, God represents to Amos the judgments he is about to bring upon Israel for its many iniquities. Chapter 7, verses 7 and 8 describe God's illustration to Amos of his attitude regarding their sins and transgressions. As we know, the Lord standing upon a wall made by a plumb line signifies the laws and commandments he has communicated to the people of Israel. The plumb line in his hand symbolizes the strict justice he will visit upon them according to their iniquities. And the phrase, "I will not pass by them anymore," is an admonition that God will no longer show them mercy in its administration of justice. Now, the candidate is prepared for the degree of Fellowcraft in much the same way he's prepared for the EA degree. The mode of dress, entrance, and reception, all these are familiar to the candidate by now. Let's move on then to the working tools. The square, for instance. The square is a symbol of morality, truthfulness, and honesty. It forms a 90-degree or right angle. And this is the angle which stones must have if they are to be used to build a stable and upright wall. Symbolizes accuracy. When we talk about squaring our actions with our fellow man, this sort of accuracy and this sort of preciseness is necessary to build the kind of friendship and relationships that we want to build. The level is the second tool introduced in the Fellowcraft's degree, and it's a symbol of equality. We do not mean equality in wealth, social distinction, civil office, and so forth, but the internal, not the external qualities of the man. Each person is endowed with a worth and dignity which is spiritual and should not be subject to man-made distinctions. Thus, the level dignifies labor and the men who perform it. It acknowledges that all men are of equal value in the eyes of God, regardless of their stations in life. And we see that in Masonry, all kinds of men from all fields of life are able to sit together, from the president right down to the gardener. And this is one of the great one of the truly great, I should say, facets of Masonry. The third tool we see in the Fellowcraft's degree is the plum, and that's a symbol of rectitude. In Masonry is associated with the plumb line where the Lord promised Amos he would set in the midst of his people Israel. It becomes a symbol of upright life and of the conscience by which each person must live. As the plumb line enables the builder to erect a straight wall, so does it enable the mason to ponder what is right and true and to build an upright life. Moving on to some of the other symbols of this degree, we talk about the pillars on the porch. These are the two pillars at the entrance of King Solomon's temple. These pillars are symbols of strength and establishment, and by implication, power and control. One must remember that power and control are placed before you, so you might realize that power without control is anarchy, and that control without power is futility. Man must have both if his life is to be successful. Now we move on to the winding staircase, which is so central to the symbolism of the Fellowcraft's degree. It's a symbol of ascension. It has 3, 5, and 7 steps. The number of steps has changed over the years in the ritual. Sometimes there were only 5, other times 7. Preston listed 36. But the idea remains the same: ascending up and seeking knowledge. The 3 steps are found in Masonry. The number 3 as many times found in Masonry. The 3 degrees, the 3 great lights, 3 columns, 3 stationed officers, on and on. We should also mention the 3 virtues again of faith, hope, and charity. These virtues were considered a ladder to heaven, another symbol of ascent. The 5 steps of the winding staircase are also explained in the degree in some detail. The geometrical symbol of 5 is, of course, the pentagram. The emblem of Pythagoras' fraternity was the 5-pointed star. The 5 steps representing the 5 orders of architecture can be understood symbolically to show that as each of us builds his inner temple, the end result will be somewhat different in appearance, just as there are differences between Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian. However, regardless of the variation, if the temple is built in the right way, it's just as worthy as the next temple built in a different style. The 5 steps also symbolize the method of learning by direct personal experience using the 5 senses. This is learning by doing, such as was the case with craftsmen working with stone. These 7 steps symbolize the 7 liberal arts and sciences, which we spoke about before. And I'd like to make a couple of points about that. One, in the mid-13th century, a Mason who had mastered the 7 liberal arts was entitled to the title of architect, which shows an elevated status among a Mason. Also, the 7 steps symbolize the method of learning from the knowledge and experience of others in a classroom setting. In order for a man to be the best architect, he must learn by 2 ways: by practicing the craft directly, which is the 5 steps we spoke about before, in addition to learning by the book in a classroom setting, which is the 7 steps. The ancient Roman architect Vitruvius makes this same observation in the 10 books on architecture, and it's just as easily applied to our speculative art. The proper balance between practice and book learning allows us to properly pursue wisdom. Now let's talk about the admission to the middle chamber. The passage from the outer porch to the middle chamber represents a definite step in the journey to enlightenment. The wages received in the middle chamber come as a result of achieving this further enlightenment. Remember that the candidate had to first ascend the winding staircase and move through the 3, 5, and 7 steps in order to gain admission. It is when the initiate begins to perceive the vision of this Masonic education, and when a special intuition begins to dawn within his mind and consciousness, that the inner doors to that chamber have really opened for him. The wages of a Fellowcraft are corn, wine, and oil, emblematical of health, plenty, and peace. These symbolize wealth in the physical and philosophic worlds. The philosophic wages are the intangible but no less real compensation for a faithful and intelligent use of the working tools, fidelity to your obligations, and unflagging interest and study of the structure, purpose, and possibilities of the fraternity. Such wages may be defined in terms of a deeper understanding of brotherhood, ethical living, a broader toleration, and a more resolute will to think justly, independently, and honestly. Now we move on to the Masonic letter G. The reason that the letter G is so prominent in Masonry is plainly given to the candidate in this degree. We are told that it is the initial of geometry as well as the initial of the Supreme Being. From the time of the old charges and manuscripts up to the present, the synonymous nature of geometry and Masonry is clearly stated. And as we talked about previously, geometry has always been held in great esteem by the great philosophers and mathematicians. The importance of geometry to a full understanding of Freemasonry becomes apparent to the candidate as he progresses through the degrees. There are many examples in history, beginning with Pythagoras and his society, and later Plato and his academy, that raised geometry to a sacred science. Plato said, "Geometry rightly treated is the knowledge of the eternal. Geometry must ever tend to draw the soul towards the truth." Later, Euclid systematically presented all the knowledge of geometry in his work Elements of Geometry, beginning with 5 unproved principles about lines, angles, and figures, which he called postulates. Euclid uses only the compass and straight edge for all the drawings, proofs, and solutions. So we can see the importance of geometry across history and embedded in our Masonic ritual. Now, the middle chamber lecture given by the Master is an excellent explanation of the value of geometry. However, we should notice how the universe is depicted as being governed by the unerring laws of nature. This is a product of Renaissance and Enlightenment thinking with its emphasis on natural philosophy. The scientists of that day adapted the new methods of natural observation and inquiry into multiple fields of study to include moral philosophy. God was described as the great architect of the universe, and this is entirely consistent with the spirit of the age. I would like to leave you on this with a couple of books that you might look at. A very basic one is The Craft and Its Symbols by Alan E. Roberts. And a fascinating newer book is done by Mario Livio, which is God a Mathematician? That concludes our section on the meaning of the degree, and we'll next proceed to some topics on Masonic Protocol. Thank you. Welcome back, brethren. Now we're going to talk about a subject that some might find a little dry, but we're going to do the best we can if you'll follow with me in your reading materials. This one has to do with Masonic Protocol. First thing we're going to start with is Masonic Law that governs our Grand Lodge and governs all our lodges and all our individual Masons. The original constitutions of Masonry were drawn up by Dr. James Anderson in 1723 for the use of the Grand Lodge of England. He drew upon many of the old Gothic constitutions to include the Cook manuscript and so forth. There, the first principles of speculative Masonry were established. Again, Dr. Desagoliers and his comrades played the greatest role in actually distilling down some of those principles into the speculative list that we find in that Constitution of 1723. As Masonry spread across Europe and to the New World, new Grand Lodges formed their own constitutions. The original Virginia Constitution of 1793 has evolved into the current Methodical Digest, which is the established Masonic law in Virginia. The digest contains a section on the Grand Lodge, on individual lodges, and guidelines for the individual Mason. The local rules for governing a lodge are to be found in its bylaws. Next, let's talk a little bit about how a lodge is governed. And in many ways, it's similar to the military, where we use a term called the chain of command. This chain of command in the Grand Lodge of Virginia flows from the Grand Master at the state level. This comes down to the District Deputy Grand Masters, who are each administering 57 districts. The DDGMs, as we call them, are the Grand Master's personal representative and serve at his pleasure. The local lodge is ruled and governed by the Worshipful Master. And of course, the term worshipful in British English simply means honorable or venerable. The Grand Master is addressed by the title Most Worshipful, a title that is retained by past Grand Masters as well. The District Deputy Grand Master is addressed as Right Worshipful, as are the past DDGMs, and the Master of the Lodge is addressed as Worshipful, as are the past Masters. It should be remembered that our ritual and etiquette has been in use for centuries, and the utmost care should be used at all times to preserve the proper level of dignity attaching to them. Now let's talk a little bit about how Masonry is organized at the district level. The Grand Lodge of Virginia uses a district system to organize and govern its lodges. It does not use the provincial Grand Lodge system that we find in England and other parts of the Commonwealth. The number of lodges in each of the 57 districts in Virginia varies greatly, from as few as 4 to as many as 11. For example, the following lodges comprise District 4, which is my district: Acacia Lodge 16, Henry Lodge 57, Mount Carmel 133, Manassas 182, Herndon 264, Haymarket 313, and Patriot Lodge 1957 at George Mason University. The ritual and etiquette, the ritual of the Grand Lodge of Virginia, is guarded and maintained by the Committee of Work. Those parts of the ritual that are permissible to print are found in the Manual of Work in the presentation volume. Not every point on Virginia Masonic etiquette is printed in black and white, but it's usually easy to obtain good advice from your local Lodge Instructor of Work, or LIW, or District Instructor of Work, DIW. Now, brethren, that concludes our look at protocol for this section of the VMU. You'll notice in your book that we have a number of frequently asked questions, FAQs, and I'd like to encourage you and your facilitator to take the time to step through those FAQs as we wrap up this Fellowcraft module of the VMU. I look forward to joining you again for the presentation of the Master Masons module, and I wish you all the best in your studies. Thank you.